Everyone who inherits something gets a house, a nest egg, a leg up. I inherited a dying corner store and $180,000 of my father's debt, 30 days to eviction, $40 of profit on a good day, and a cousin who laughed that I'd finally gotten exactly what I was worth. Then one night the storeroom door didn't open onto the storeroom. It opened onto a walled city freezing to death in a winter that never ends, where a $2 lighter is a week of fire, a can of food is a life, and their gold is worth a fortune back home. One door, one man through it, once a day. By the time the Frost Lords who rationed survival understood what I was, I had not lifted a single weapon. I had just made everything they hoarded worthless, and 40,000 people warm. Scarcity is a story someone tells you to keep you in line. I sold them a different one. If you think being rich across a single doorway sounds worth an evening of your time, subscribe. I tell these from the bottom, and this one starts under a pile of overdue notices. But the first crate I ever carried through was only meant to keep my own lights on. Let me start there. My name is Cole. Cole Hartley, if you're reading it off the sign above a store that had my family's name on it for 60 years, and about 4 more weeks after that. The store was called Hartley General, and it sold the kind of things a small town needs and never thanks you for. Canned soup, motor oil, batteries, rat traps, work gloves, light bulbs, 40 different sizes of screw, sorted into drawers my grandfather had labeled by hand. When I was a kid, it felt like a place that had always existed and always would. When I was 26 and standing behind the register at 11 at night with a stack of red-stamped envelopes, it felt like a boat with a hole in it, and I was the only one still bailing. My father died in the spring. Heart fast, no warning. He left me the store, the building, and the debt he had been hiding behind a smile for 6 years. $180,000 spread across a banknote on the building and a line of credit he had maxed out keeping the lights on. The bank gave me until the end of the month. After that, the building went to a developer who wanted to knock it down and put up a parking lot for the pharmacy across the street. I did the math every night because the math was the only thing that stayed still. The store cleared about $40 a day when the day was good. Call it $1,100 a month if nothing broke. The minimum the bank wanted to keep the wolves at the door was $2,000 a month. And I could not make $2,000 a month selling screws to a town that was itself slowly going out of business. So I was going to lose it. That was the truth I carried around in my chest like a stone. I just had not said it out loud yet, because saying it out loud would make it real, and I wanted a few more nights of it not being real. My cousin Miles said it out loud for me. Miles is the kind of man who reads the room, finds the person with the least, and stands next to them so he looks taller. When my father was alive, Miles borrowed money and never paid it back and called it family. When the will was read, Miles had already talked my aunt into signing over the cash accounts to him, so what was left, the store and the debt, came to me. He shook my hand at the lawyer's office and told me, with real warmth in his voice, that it was good I finally had something to be responsible for. Then he went out to a car worth more than my whole inventory and drove away. He came by the store the week the bank sent the final notice. He stood in the doorway in a coat that cost more than my monthly shortfall and looked around at the shelves like a man appraising a corpse. He said he might buy the block when the bank took it. Sentimental value, he said. Keep it in the family. He said it the way you'd pat a dog you were about to put down. I did not have anything to say back that would not have gotten me arrested. So I said nothing, which he took as agreement, which is the thing about men like Miles. Silence sounds like winning to them. He left. I locked the door behind him and stood in the dark and listened to the cooler hum and the wind push at the old windows, and I thought, not for the first time, that a man could work every hour God gave him and still end up with less than he started with. Because the game was rigged before he sat down. Then I went to the storeroom to do inventory I did not need to do, because moving boxes was better than sitting still, and that is where the whole rest of my life turned on a hinge. The storeroom is a long, narrow room at the back of the store. Cinder block walls, a bare bulb, a heavy steel door my grandfather hung in 1961 that is always stuck in the winter. I keep the overflow stock there. Canned goods, cases of water, propane canisters for the camp stoves nobody buys anymore, road salt by the pallet because this town ices over from October to April. I had my hand on that steel door, the storeroom door, the one that opens onto the loading alley out back. I had opened it 10,000 times. I opened it that night without thinking, to prop it and get some air moving, and the air that came through it was wrong. It was cold, not autumn alley cold. Deep cold, the kind that reaches into your lungs and closes a fist, the kind of cold that has a smell, old stone and wood smoke, and something underneath it like frozen iron. And it was dark on the other side in a way the alley never was, because the alley had a street light, and this had nothing. This had a black that swallowed the light from my bulb 3 feet in and gave nothing back. I stood there with the door half open and my heart going, and I told myself the streetlight was out, the power was down, a storm had rolled in. I told myself a lot of things in about 4 seconds. Then something moved in the dark on the other side, low and small, and a voice said a word I did not know in a language I had never heard, and I did the bravest and stupidest thing I have ever done. I picked up the flashlight off the shelf, and I pointed it through the door. The beam did not land on my alley. It did not land on a dumpster or a chain-link fence or the back of the pharmacy. It landed on a stone floor furred with frost, on fallen timbers crusted in ice, on the collapsed shelves of what had once been somebody's cellar. And crouched between 2 fallen beams, thin as a coat hanger, wrapped in a blanket that was more holes than blanket, was a child. A girl, Nell, though I would not learn her name for days. 6, maybe 7, I am bad at ages. Her lips were gray. Her eyes were huge, and they fixed on the flashlight like it was the sun, and she did not run, because she did not have the warmth left in her to run. Every rational part of me said, close the door. Close the door, call someone. This is not real. This is a break in the world. And nothing good comes through a break in the world. I stepped through instead. I want to be honest about why, because later a lot of people would decide I was some kind of hero, and I was not. I stepped through because she was a kid, and she was freezing, and I had a store full of the exact things a freezing person needs, 40 feet behind me, and there is a math even a broke man understands, and that math said a life is worth more than my fear. The cold on the other side hit me like a wall. My breath went white. The floor under my boots was solid ice over stone. I crouched down slow, the way you do with a scared animal, and I put the flashlight down so the light bounced up soft off the frost instead of blinding her. And I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went back through the door, and I came back with things. A wool blanket off the camping shelf, $12, still in its plastic. A handful of the chemical hand warmers I sold to hunters, $1 a piece. A can of chicken soup and the pull tab kind so she would not need a can opener. And a lighter, one of the long-nosed ones for lighting grills, $2.19, because I saw a rusted iron brazier in the corner of that cellar with a few sticks of frozen wood in it. And I understood, the way you understand a thing in your body, before your brain catches up, that these people did not have fire the way we have fire. They had fire the way we have gold. I lit the brazier. The wood was half frozen and it fought me. But the lighter did in 10 seconds what a struggling person with flint would fight for an hour to do. And then there was flame, actual flame, orange and alive in that dead blue cellar. And the girl made a sound I have not been able to forget, a small broken sound of pure animal relief. And she crawled to the fire and put her stick-thin hands out to it. And started to cry. I wrapped the blanket around her. I cracked the hand warmers and tucked them against her. And I opened the soup and she drank it straight from the can in long shaking pulls, and I knelt there in a freezing cellar in a world that could not exist, and I thought, very clearly, one plain sentence. These people are dying for things I throw away. That is when the boots came down the stairs, and a blade came to my throat. She moved fast, whoever she was, faster than the cold should have allowed. One second I was kneeling by the fire, and the next there was cold steel under my jaw, and a knee in my back, and a voice in my ear, low and hard, in that language I did not know, but somehow, standing in the light of that impossible doorway, half understood, the way you understand a song in a language you have never learned when it is angry enough. She wanted to know what I was, where I had come from, what I had done to the child. I did not fight. I have never been much of a fighter, and something told me that this was a person who was very, very good at it, and that my one advantage in this entire situation was that I was not a threat and needed her to believe it. So I stayed still, and I kept my hands open, and I nodded at the girl, who was warm now, warm and crying and alive, holding the empty soup can against her chest like it was made of gold. The blade did not move, but I felt the person behind it look. Look at the fire that should not exist. Look at the blanket, the strange bright wrappers of the hand warmers, the smooth painted can. Look at the doorway behind me, which from her side was not a door in a wall, but a rectangle of warm yellow light, hanging in the frozen dark, my little store glowing on the other side of the cold like a lamp at the bottom of the sea. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not softer. Sharper, the way a mind sharpens when it stops seeing a threat and starts seeing a question it cannot answer. She let me turn around. She kept the blade up. She was young, my age or close to it, though the cold and whatever life this was had put 10 hard years in her eyes. Dark hair cut short under a battered helm, a soldier's coat patched at the elbows and belted tight, frost in her eyebrows, a jaw set like she had not been warm or safe or off her guard in longer than she could remember. On the shoulder of the coat was a worn insignia, a walled tower over a flame, and I would learn later that it meant she was a captain of the hold's guard, and that the flame in it was a bitter joke, because the hold had almost no fire left to guard. Her name was Vera. I did not know it yet. I did not know any of it yet. I only knew that she was staring at me the way you stare at something that breaks a rule you have organized your whole life around, and that when her eyes went from my glowing doorway to my ordinary face, what was in them was not gratitude. It was hunger. Not for herself. For what I could do for a city full of people I had not seen yet. In the dark beyond that cellar, 40,000 of them, freezing one night at a time inside walls that kept the wind out and nothing else. She asked me one more question, slow, making sure I understood the weight of it. She pointed at the fire, at the blanket, at the doorway, and she asked whether there was more. And God help me, I thought about the bank, and the notices and Miles in his good coat telling me I had finally gotten what I was worth. I thought about a storeroom full of the cheapest, most ordinary things in the world, water and salt and soup and fire, sitting on shelves in a dying town where nobody had $2 to spend on them. And I thought about the gold this girl held, the empty can she clutched like treasure, and the older, heavier truth underneath it that I could feel closing around me like the cold itself. There was more. There was a whole world of more 40 feet behind me, and I was the only door it had. I said yes. It was the most expensive word I have ever said, and the best, and I have never once been sorry, no matter what it cost, and it cost nearly everything. But that first night, all it cost me was a blanket, some soup, and a $2 lighter. And when I stepped back through the doorway into the warm, electric hum of my own store, shaking, half convinced I had lost my mind, I found that the girl had pressed something into my coat pocket without my noticing. The way a starving person gives you the only thing they have because they do not know how else to say what they feel. It was a coin. Heavy, cold, irregular, stamped with that same walled tower. I bit it because I had seen people bite coins in movies, and I did not know what else to do. It was soft the way only one metal is soft. It was gold. Real gold. More gold than I had held in my hand in my entire life, given to me by a freezing child in exchange for a can of soup I had bought 12 for $1. I stood in my empty store at midnight with $180,000 of debt over my head and a lump of impossible gold in my face. And for the first time since my father died, I did the math, and the math came out different. Then I looked back at the storeroom. The steel door had swung shut on its own. When I opened it, the alley was there, the dumpster, the chain link, the buzzing streetlight, exactly where they were supposed to be. No cold, no cellar, no frozen city, just the ordinary world, sealing itself back up like water over a stone. I did not sleep that night. I sat behind the register and turned the gold coin over and waited for the world to make sense again. And it did not. And just before dawn, I understood something that would run my life for the next year. The door had opened at midnight. Not before. I had tried the alley a dozen times before 11, and it was only ever the alley. It opened when the store was closed and dark and mine, and it had closed again within the hour. Once a day. That was the rule. I did not know the others yet, the ones that would nearly kill me. The ones about what a single man could carry and what the door would take from me if I ever stopped owning the place it lived in. But I knew the first rule that first night, sitting there with the coin, watching the sky go gray over a town that had written me off. Once a day, a door opened between everything I had too much of and everyone who had nothing at all. And I was done bailing a sinking boat. I was going to start carrying. The next day I learned the door had rules, and that the rules were not on my side so much as they were simply true, the way gravity is true, indifferent to whether you find it convenient. I spent the whole day getting ready, which is a thing I am good at. Getting ready is just inventory pointed at the future. I closed the store early, put a handwritten sign in the window, "Family Matter, back tomorrow," and I loaded a hand truck with everything I thought a freezing city might want. Cases of canned food, a pallet jack's worth of road salt, because I remembered that in every history I had ever read salt was money, that people had been paid in it, that the word salary came from it. Propane canisters, boxes of the $2 lighters and the butane to refill them, wool blankets, first aid kits, because a world without fire was a world without clean bandages and boiled water. I stacked it all by the storeroom door, and I waited for midnight like a kid waiting for a holiday, and at midnight the cold came through, and I pushed the loaded hand truck at the doorway. It did not go. The truck hit the threshold and stopped like it had run into a wall. Though there was nothing there, only the frozen cellar on the other side, and my own breath fogging in front of me. I pushed harder. The wheels spun. I took a case of soup off the top and carried it through in my arms, and it went easy, no resistance at all. I came back and tried the truck again empty this time, and the truck would not cross either. Not the truck, not the pallet jack, not a rope tied to a sled, nothing with wheels, nothing dragged, nothing that let me move more than my own 2 arms could hold. One man. What one man could carry. That was the second rule, and I want you to understand how much of everything that followed grew out of that one stingy sentence, because a lesser limit would have made me a warehouse, and a richer one would have made me a god, and instead, it made me something more useful than either. It made me a man who had to choose. That first real night I chose wrong, and it taught me more than choosing right would have. I loaded my arms with canned food, all of it, as much protein and calories as I could stack against my chest, because my gut said, feed them, and I staggered through into the cellar and found Vera waiting with 2 others of the guard and a single guttering lamp, and I dumped 40 pounds of canned soup on the frozen floor like a fool presenting a feast. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she asked me, through the strange half-understanding, that the doorway gave us both whether I had brought fire. I had not. I had brought food, and food you cannot eat if you are too cold to lift the spoon. Food that freezes solid in an hour in a city where the average night killed people in their sleep. I had brought the second thing they needed, instead of the first, because I had thought like a man with a warm kitchen instead of a man in a war. Vera did not shame me for it. That was the first thing that made me trust her before anything else did. She just knelt and cracked a can with her knife and put it in the hands of the nearest of her soldiers, a boy named Taller who did not look old enough to hold the spear leaned against the wall behind him, and she told me plainly The way you would explain the ground to someone who had just fallen out of the sky. What her city actually was. It was called Emberhold. 40,000 souls, give or take the ones the last cold snap had taken, walled inside a fortress that had been built to hold against armies, and now held against nothing but the weather which no wall has ever stopped. Above them, at the center of the hold, stood the hearth, and I will tell you about the hearth later, because it is the whole spine of this story. But for now, know only this. It was the last great fire in the world, older than the walls, and it was rationed. Every household got an hour of its warmth a day, carried home as embers in an iron box, and if you missed your hour or lost your box or could not pay the tithe the frost court set on it, you did without. And in Emberhold, doing without was another word for dying. The long cold they called the winter. Not a season. A verdict. It had been deepening for 11 years, a degree colder every year, and no one living remembered a spring, and the fields outside the walls were iron, and the granary inside them was measured now in weeks. Salt to cure what little meat the hunters brought was worth its weight in silver. Seed grain was worth more than gold, because gold cannot be eaten, and a handful of seed is a field. If you ever get a spring to plant it in, which no one believed anymore, into that I had a door. Into that, a $2 lighter was not a convenience. It was a week of guaranteed fire that no court could ration and no tithe could tax. Into that, a bag of road salt was a fortune in preservation. A case of canned food was a family through a hard week. A wool blanket was the difference between a child waking up and a child not. I understood, kneeling on that ice, exactly what I was holding. Not charity. Not even mainly charity, though I would end up giving away more than I ever sold. What I was holding was the single greatest arbitrage in the history of two worlds. And arbitrage is just a fancy word for buying a thing where it is cheap and selling it where it is dear. And there has never in all of time been a gap between cheap and dear, like the gap between a dollar store in a dying town and a fortress freezing to death. So I learned to carry right. Fire first, always. A layer of lighters and butane and hand warmers against my body where they would not freeze. Then salt, because salt was money there and did not spoil. Then medicine, then food, in that order, because that was the order that kept the most people breathing per pound. And a man who can only carry so much learns fast to think in people per pound. And I learned what came back the other way. They paid me in what they had, which was the strange, dense wealth of a civilization that had been rich once and had nothing left to spend it on. Gold, old coins stamped with towers and suns and faces of kings no one remembered. Silver by the handful. And relics, which is my word, not theirs, for the things I did not understand yet. A black stone that was always faintly warm to the touch, a vial of dust that glowed, a palm-sized disc of pale metal, dense as lead, that hummed against my teeth like the vial of glowing beetle light in a story I would not hear for years. I did not know what any of it was. I only knew that when I carried the gold back through my door and drove it 2 towns, over to a coin dealer who asked no questions, it weighed out real and paid real. And the first payment I ever made to the bank that way was $4,000 in cash, laid on the counter of a loan. Officer who had been waiting 3 weeks to foreclose on me. Her face when I counted it out is a thing I will treasure until I die. Miles heard about it within the day, because in a small town money moves slower than the news of money. He called me, which he never did. He was casual about it, fishing, the way he was casual about everything he actually cared about. He had heard I made a payment. He had heard I was doing better. He wanted to know, brother to brother, where a man with a dying store had come up with $4,000, and under the friendliness was the thing that ran Miles all the way to the bottom, which was that he could not stand for someone he had written off to have something he did not understand. I told him I sold some old inventory. I told him my father had a way of finding value in things other people threw away. Both of those were true in their way, and neither of them was the truth. And I hung up on him smiling for the first time in months, which should have warned me, because a man like Miles cannot leave a thing he does not understand alone. He picks at it. He follows it home. The girl from the first night came back too. Nell, her name was, and she had a way of appearing at the edge of the cellar lamplight the moment I came through, not begging, just present, watching me unload with the grave attention of a child who has learned that food is not a thing you assume. I always carried something for her, specifically. A chocolate bar the first time, which she held without eating for a full minute, because she did not have the word for what it was, and did not trust that it was allowed. An orange once, which undid her completely. This small, cold girl, turning a piece of ordinary summer over and over in her hands like I had carried the sun through the door in my coat pocket. I had grown up thinking an orange was nothing. In Emberhold, I watched an orange make a child cry, and something in me that miles in the bank in the long gray year had worn down to almost nothing started, very slowly, to come back. On my side, the work of turning gold into a paid-down debt had its own rhythm. I could not walk into my own town's bank with fistfuls of ancient coin, so I drove. A coin dealer 2 towns over, then a gold buyer in the city, then a private collector I found, who paid a premium for anything old and strange and asked nothing at all. I spread it thin so no one number got big enough to become a question. I kept the relics, the warm stone, and the glowing dust and the humming disc in a locked drawer under the register because something told me they were worth more than gold, and something else told me I was not ready to find out how. Every dollar of it landed on the same pile, the pile that used to only ever get smaller. 180,000 became 170, then 160. The stone in my chest did not vanish, but for the first time it had a shape I could see the far side of. But the gold drew eyes on both sides of the door. On mine it was only Miles for now, and Miles was a slow animal. On the other side, the animal was quicker, because I was not the only one who had noticed that strange new goods were flowing into the poorest quarter of a dying city, and the man who noticed had a great deal more experience than Miles at following money home. His name was Rook. The cellar my door opened into sat in the worst part of Emberhold, a district they called the Cinder Warren, a maze of collapsed buildings and frozen alleys pressed up against the inside of the outer wall, the place the hold put the people it had given up on. No hearth ember reached the Cinder Warren. No Frost Court titheman bothered to climb down into it. It was governed, if you can call it that, by men who had realized that in a place with no law, the only law is who controls the things people need, and Rook controlled them all. The little fires, the scavenged wood, the thin trickle of black market salt that came down from the upper city at a markup that bled the poor white. He was not a large man. Vera told me later he had been a clerk once, a tithe counter, before the cold took his fingers and his post. And there is no cruelty like the cruelty of a man who used to keep the books deciding to keep them for himself. Rook noticed me the way a spider notices a change in the tension of its web. Goods he had not taxed. Fire he had not sold. A quarter of the Cinder Warren that suddenly, quietly, was not quite as desperate as it had been, was not quite as easy to squeeze, because somewhere a door was opening and someone was carrying miracles through it. And every coin those miracles saved was a coin that did not end up in Rook's frozen hand. He sent men first. 2 of them found me in the cellar on my 6th or 7th crossing, big men gone thin, carrying the kind of improvised weapons that tell you a place has run out of real ones. And they explained to me the way of things in the Cinder Warren. Everything that came in paid Rook a share. Everyone who traded in his district traded with his blessing. I was new, so this was a friendly visit, an education. Next time would not be friendly. Vera put herself between them and me before I had finished understanding I was being threatened. And there was a moment, blades half drawn in a freezing cellar, when I saw exactly how thin the ice was that I had been walking on. How the door had made me feel safe when the door had done nothing of the kind. The door made me rich. It did not make me strong. It could not throw a punch or hold a wall. On this side, I was a soft man from a warm world, standing in the coldest, hungriest place I had ever seen, holding the one thing everyone in it would kill for. And the only wall between me and that fact was a tired captain's with a patched coat and a habit of standing in front of people. The men left that time. They left because Vera was who she was, and because two was not enough, and they knew it. But they left with a message, and I carried my own message back through the door that night and sat with it in the dark of my store, turning a warm black stone over in my hand. Rook wanted a cut. Rook always got his cut. That was the shape of power in the Cinder Warren, and I was about to learn that it was the shape of power in the whole hold, all the way up to the hearth, all the way up to a man in the Frost Court I had not heard of yet, who ran the exact same racket. Rook ran, only with a city instead of a slum, and 40,000 lives instead of a few hundred. Everyone in that world was Rook. Everyone with anything had figured out that the way you stayed on top in a dying world was to own the dying, to stand between people and the things that kept them alive, and take your toll. I was going to have to become something none of them had ever seen. Not a bigger Rook, the opposite of Rook. And I did not know it yet, sitting there with the stone warm in my hand and the bank paid for one more month. But the opposite of a man who owns scarcity is not a man who owns more. It is a man who ends it. Rook's men came back on the 9th crossing, and this time there were 6 of them, and this time they were not there to educate me. I had known it was coming. Vera had known it sooner. She had spent the days between telling me, in the flat, unhappy voice of a soldier, explaining a losing position, exactly how this went. Rook did not negotiate with a new source of goods. He took it, or he broke it, so no one else could have it either. A man who lived by controlling what was scarce could not allow a thing that made things less scarce to exist in his district. It was not personal. It was arithmetic. I was a hole in his market, and he was going to plug me. The obvious move was to fight, and the obvious move was suicide. 6 desperate men against one soft shopkeeper and one captain in a frozen cellar with a doorway at my back that I could run through but could not defend, because the moment they understood the door was the source, the moment anyone in that world understood, there was a rectangle of warm light that vomited miracles once a night. My life stopped being worth a single. Vera could kill 2, maybe 3. She said it without any drama, the way she said everything. A woman doing sums with her own life as one of the numbers. 2, maybe 3, and then they would both be dead, and Nell and the others would go back to freezing, and Rook would seal the cellar, and that would be the end of the only good thing that had happened to Emberhold in 11 years. So I did not fight. I did the thing I actually knew how to do. The only thing I had ever been good at, the thing 60 years of Hartley's had done behind that counter, while the world called it small. I ran the numbers, and then I ran Rook out of business. Here's what I understood that Rook did not, because Rook had learned the world in a place where things only ever ran out. Rook's whole empire, his men, his muscle, his grip on a few hundred frozen lives, rested on one thing and one thing only: that fire and salt and food were scarce, and that he owned the scarce supply. Every enforcer who worked for him because working for Rook meant eating, and not working for Rook meant not eating. His power was not in his fists. It was in the empty bellies of the men whose fists they were. So I filled them. I did not offer to buy Rook's men. You cannot buy a starving man's loyalty. You can only rent his fear. What I did was quieter, and it could not be fought. I started giving fire away. Not to Rook, to everyone else. I took Vera, who knew every alley and every family in the Cinder Warren, and I turned my nightly carry into a flood aimed straight at the base of Rook's pyramid. Every household that had been buying Rook's black market embers at a robber's price got a $2 lighter and a can of butane, free, with a quiet word from a captain. They trusted that there would be more, that they did not need Rook's fire anymore, that the price of staying warm had just dropped to nothing. I salted the quarter until Rook's salt would not sell. I put food in the hands of the exact families whose hunger Rook had been renting, and I did it in 3 nights, faster than he could understand what was happening to him, because he was thinking like a man defending a monopoly. and I was thinking like a man who wanted the monopoly to stop existing. The operation itself was the most alive I had felt since my father died. On my side, it meant scale, and scale meant leaving my own town. A single case of lighters would not flood a quarter. I needed pallets. So I drove 90 minutes to the nearest warehouse club, the kind of cavernous place that sells you 1,000 of anything if you have the card, and I walked those concrete aisles with a flatbed cart and a shopping list written in people per pound. Lighters by the gross. Butane by the case. 50-pound bags of water softener salt, which is just salt, stacked to the ceiling, and cheaper than the road salt I had been carrying. Rice and beans in sacks. Cheap wool blankets, thermal socks, the foil emergency bivvies that weigh nothing and hold a body's heat like a secret. I filled a cart, and then another, and I paid with a fold of cash that used to be an Emberhold King's face, and the bored teenager at the register scanned 400 lighters without once looking up. And I thought about what those 400 lighters were about to mean to 400 families in a city she would never believe existed, and I had to turn away so she would not see my face. I ran the goods home, stacked them by the storeroom door, and every midnight I carried what one man could carry into a war against a price. That was the rhythm now. Warehouse to store to door to the cinder warren, a bucket brigade with a single link, and the single link was me. On the Emberhold side, Vera was the map and the muscle and the trust I did not have. She knew which families Rook bled hardest, and we hit those first on purpose, because the point was not to feed the quarter evenly, it was to cut Rook's roots. A widow named Halden, who had been trading her dead husband's tools for embers, one hammer at a time. We left her a lighter and a month of butane, and she did not understand for a full minute that no one was going to come collect. A pair of old brothers who ran a shivering flophouse for men too broken to work. We salted them, fed them, and by the second night the men in that flophouse were the ones spreading the word through the cinder warren faster than any crier, that the price of living had dropped to nothing, that there was a captain and a stranger who gave and did not take, and Rook's own men heard it in their own homes. That was the blade I never had to swing. One of his enforcers, a slab of a man called Bran, with a face like a cliff and a sick daughter, came to the cellar on the third night. Vera put herself between us on reflex, and he lifted his empty hands and said he had not come for Rook. He had come because his girl had a cough that was turning into the cough that killed, and word was the stranger had medicine, real medicine, the kind the upper city hoarded. I gave him a course of children's antibiotics and a bottle of fever syrup and showed him the dose on my fingers, and I watched a man who broke ribs for a living stand in a freezing cellar and shake, and he did not go back to Rook. Why would he? Rook had never once, in 11 years, done anything but take. The whole time Bran had worked for him, Rook had been standing between Bran's daughter and the thing that could save her and taking a toll on the gap. That is what all of them were. That is what the whole world was, top to bottom, and I was only just starting to see how far up it went. By the fourth night, Rook's men started not showing up. You have to understand what I had done to them without ever raising a hand. A man who worked for Rook did it to feed his family. Now his family was warm and fed and had been made, warm and fed by someone who asked nothing of them, who did not want their fists, who had, by the simple act of abundance, dissolved the hunger that was the only thing tying them to a man they hated. Why would you break your back and risk your life, enforcing the price of fire for a man, when the fire had just become free? Rook's power had never been his own. It had been borrowed, every day, from the desperation of the people beneath him, and I had quietly paid off the debt of desperation that they owed him. And when that debt was gone, there was nothing holding his empire up but habit and cold does not enforce anything for free. Rook came himself at the end. He had to. There was no one left to send. He came down into the cellar alone, a small, gray man with 2 missing fingers and the eyes of an accountant who has watched a column that always added up his way stop adding up at all. And he did not have a weapon out because he had finally understood that the weapon had never been the point. He looked at the crates. He looked at Vera, who did not bother to draw on him. He looked at me, a soft man from nowhere, who had unmade in a week the thing he had spent 11 years building on other people's misery, and he asked me the only question a man like that has left when the numbers turn on him. He asked me what I wanted, because that was the only frame he had. Everyone wants a cut. Everyone stands between people and what they need and takes their toll. He had assumed from the first that I was a rival racket, a cleverer rook, and he had come to sue for terms, to find out how much of the cinder warren I would leave him. And the thing that broke him, I watched it break him, was my answer, which was that I did not want anything he had. I did not want his district. I did not want his cut. I did not want to stand where he stood at all. I wanted his product to be worthless, and I had already made it so, and there was nothing he could offer me, because I had built my position on making his position not matter. He left the way a man leaves who has just learned the ground he stood on was never real. I did not have him hurt. I did not need to. Vera wanted to, a little, for the families he had bled, and I understood why, but I told her the truth I was only just then learning myself, which was that hurting Rook changed nothing, and feeding the cinder warren changed everything. And that the second I started fighting men like him with fists, instead of abundance, I would just be a new kind of Rook, and the whole miracle of the door was that it let me be something else. Asa. And miracle. She looked at me for a long moment after I said that. Something shifted in her face, some last held-back thing, the wariness of a woman who had learned the hard way that anyone offering her people something for nothing was setting a hook. It did not vanish. Vera's wariness never fully vanished. It was welded on too deep. But it moved aside, just enough, and she stopped guarding me like a suspect and started standing beside me like an ally. And that was worth more to me than all the gold I carried, though it would be a while before I let myself know why. We ate together that night, the two of us, and Nell and the boy soldier, whose name was Taller. Around the little brazier in the cellar, canned stew heated over a $2 flame, and for an hour the four of us were just warm, and it was the best meal of my life. Vera told me about Emberhold before the cold, about summers she barely remembered, about her mother who had been a captain before her and had died on the wall in a winter, that everyone had sworn would be the worst and turned out to be only the fourth worst, so far. Nell fell asleep against my side with an orange peel still clutched in her fist. And I sat there in an impossible city with warm people around a fire I had made, and I thought that if this was all the door ever gave me, it would already have given me more than the whole warm world I came from ever had. It was not all the door would give me. It was not even close. But that is the trouble with a warm hour in a cold place. It makes you forget, just for a while, that the cold is a system, and that systems have owners, and that the owner of this one was about to notice me. Because abundance leaves a mark the same way scarcity does. When I flooded the cinder warren with cheap salt and free fire, I did not just break Rook. I crashed a price. And prices in a city run by men who live off the spread between what a thing costs and what the desperate will pay for it are watched. In the counting houses of the upper city, in the ledgers of the Frost Court's quartermaster, a number that had been reliably, profitably high for Lev Emberhold suddenly went soft, and then went to almost nothing. And a man named Dace, who had grown fat in a starving city on exactly that spread, looked up from his books and asked the question that would nearly get me killed. He asked where it was all coming from. Dace was Rook with a title and a granary and 40,000 people to bleed, instead of a few hundred, and he was much harder to break because he was not standing on desperate men. He was standing on the law. He held the office of quartermaster of the Frost Court, which meant he controlled the official ration, the grain that came out of the great granary, and the salt that came out of the Hold's own stores, and the tithe that every scrap of trade in Emberhold owed to the court above it. On paper, he was a servant of the Hold, keeper of its stores against the long cold. In practice, he was the largest and most respectable racketeer in the city, and the difference between Dace and Rook was only that Dace had learned to call his toll a tax and his hoard a reserve, and no one climbs down into a slum to check a slumlord's ledgers, but everyone bows to a man with a chain of office, and that is the whole trick of it, the only trick there has ever been. Steal a fire and you are a thief. Steal a city's fire and you are the Frost Court. He came at me through the law because that was his ground. He could not find the source. The crashed price in the Cinder Warren had no visible cause, no caravan, no mine, no supplier he could lean on. And it drove him half mad, Vera said, this abundance that came from nowhere. So he did what men who own scarcity always do when abundance appears, and they cannot own it. He made it a crime. He declared the new goods contraband, untithed, dangerous, a plague of unlicensed trade that threatened the good order of the ration, and he sent tithemen down into the Cinder Warren with writs and clubs to seize the lighters and the salt and the blankets out of people's hands, and where they would become, of course, part of his reserve to be rationed back to the same people at his price. To be rationed back to the same people at his price. The first seizure was ugly. I was not there. I heard it from Vera with her jaw so tight the words barely got out. They took Halden's butane. They took the Flophouse brothers' salt. They took a lighter out of the hands of a girl not much older than Nell and called it enforcement of the ration, and a man who protested got his arm broken for it. And the message was plain, and it was the oldest message in any world. The scarce thing belongs to us. Your abundance is a crime against our power. Be grateful for your hour of fire, and do not ask why it is only an hour. I could have fought it the loud way. I did not, and I want to explain why, because it is the whole shape of how I fought, all of them, all the way up. You cannot outmuscle the law. Vera had 11 soldiers she trusted, and Dace had the Frost Court, and a war in the streets would have gotten my people killed and my door found. What Dace had that I could take was not his tithemen. It was the thing underneath the tithemen, the thing every one of these rackets rested on. His power was the price. As long as grain and salt and fire were scarce, and he owned the scarce supply, every writ he wrote had teeth, because people will obey anything for the thing that keeps them alive. So I made his supply worthless, the same as I had made Rook's, only bigger. I stopped trickling, and I started drowning. I turned every crossing into as much bulk staple as one man could bear, rice and beans and flour and salt, and Vera and her soldiers, and the whole quietly grateful Cinder Warren turned into a distribution network. Dace could not see, and could not raid fast enough. And we did not sell it, we gave it. We put a week of food in every hand, in the lowest quarter and then the quarter above it, until the thing Dace sold, the thing his entire office was built to ration, simply stopped being scarce for the people at the bottom. And a tax on a thing that is no longer scarce is not a tax. It is a joke. His writs stopped having teeth because you cannot threaten to withhold from a man the thing he already has more of than you do. And then I did the thing that finished him, which was that I made it visible. Dace's power depended not just on scarcity, but on the belief that the scarcity was real, was natural, was the fault of the long cold, and not of the fat man sitting on the stores. So Vera, who was a captain of the guard, and whose word carried where mine could not, started telling people a simple true thing as she handed out the grain. She told them that the granary was not empty, that the reserve was full, that there was food enough in Dace's stores to end the ration tomorrow, and that the only reason there was a ration at all was that a hungry city is an obedient city, and a fed city asks questions. She did not have to lie. In a place run on manufactured scarcity, the truth is the most radical thing you can hand a person, more radical than fire, and it spreads faster because a man will keep a truth warm in his chest long after the ember box has gone cold. Dace broke in a council chamber, not a cellar. I was not there for that either, but I have the shape of it from Vera, who was standing at the back in her patched coat while the quartermaster tried to explain to the Frost Court why the lowest quarters of the hold were no longer paying his tithe, no longer feared his ration, no longer believed the granary was empty, and could not, when pressed by a crowd, at his own storehouse doors, be shown that it was. A man whose entire authority rested on a scarcity he had been quietly faking cannot survive the moment the scarcity is exposed as a choice. He was stripped of the office within the week, not out of justice. The Frost Court did not care about justice. They stripped him because a quartermaster, who could no longer make the people afraid of hunger, was no longer useful to them, and they needed a new one who could. And that, right there, was the first time I understood that Dace had never been the enemy. Dace was a symptom. The disease was a court that needed its people hungry, and it would grow a new Dace the way a body grows a fever. And I had not cured anything. I had just made them notice the infection had a source. It was around then that Vera asked me, for the first time, what was on the other side of my door. We were in the cellar after a crossing, the brazier low, Nell asleep, and she had watched me step out of a rectangle of warm gold light one too many times to keep pretending she was not eaten alive by it. So I told her. I told her about a world with no long cold, a world so drowning in the things her people died for that we let them rot on shelves and threw them in the ground. I told her a lighter cost less than an hour of her wages would have, that salt came in bags a man could barely lift, and no one thought it was wealth, that there were rooms the size of her whole quarter stacked to the roof with food that would go bad before anyone bought it. I watched her try to hold it, and I watched it not fit, the way it had not fit for me when she first told me about the hearth, and at the end of it she was quiet for a long time. And then she asked the question that I should have seen coming and did not. She asked why, if my world had so much, my world had not come through the door to save hers. And I had no answer, because the true answer was that my world did not know hers existed. And even if it had, my world was Dace and Rook all the way down too, a place where abundance sat behind locks and prices while people who could not pay went without, a place where I myself had been 30 days from losing everything in the middle of all that plenty. I did not tell her that. I was ashamed to, but she read it in my face the way she read everything, and she did not look disappointed. She looked like a soldier confirming the size of the thing she was up against. The cold was not the enemy. The cold was just weather. The enemy was that in every world, apparently in hers and in mine, there were men who had learned to stand between people and enough, and take a toll on the gap, and call it order. I could not bring her through. Tried once quietly, when she was not looking, put my hand on her arm and stepped toward the light and felt the threshold stop her cold, the same wall the hand truck had hit. Only me. The door was mine, and it was lonely in its mercy, one man wide. And I think that was the moment I stopped thinking of Vera as someone I was helping, and started thinking of her as someone I was fighting beside, because you do not grieve that you cannot carry a stranger into safety. You only grieve it for someone you have started, without permission, to love. While Emberhold was learning my name without knowing my face, my own world was doing the same, and it wore my cousins. The debt was down to 60,000 by then. I had made payment after payment, spread thin, laundered careful, and the bank had gone from measuring me for a coffin to actually being pleased to see me, and I decided it was time to do the thing that mattered more than any of it, the thing I had understood since the second week. The door lived where the store lived. As long as the building was the bank's, the door was on loan, and a loan can be called. I wanted the deed. I wanted the whole thing paid off and in my own name, walls and storeroom and steel door and all, so that no man in a good coat could ever again decide whether the door existed. Miles found out I was moving to buy out the note before I had finished filing the paperwork, because Miles had a friend at the bank, the way Miles always had a friend anywhere money changed hands. And Miles could not stand it. It was never about the store. He had called it a corpse to my face. It was that I, the cousin he had written off, the one he had congratulated for finally having something to be responsible for, was about to own a thing free and clear while he still owed on the car he had bought with my father's money. So he moved to take it from me. He went to the developer who had been circling my block for the parking lot, and he offered to partner, to buy the building the moment the bank foreclosed, to snatch it out from under me at the auction he was sure was still coming. Because Miles did not know the auction was never coming anymore. He found out the way he found out everything, too late and in public. I paid off the note in a single cashier's check on a Tuesday morning, $100 and some thousand that had started as a freezing child's gold coin, and I took the deed in my own name in front of the same loan officer, who had once counted the days until she could take it, and I was walking out of the bank with 60 years of my family's name finally, wholly mine, when Miles came in to sign his partnership papers with the developer and saw me holding the deed to the thing he had come to steal. I did not gloat. I want that on the record, not because I am better than that, but because gloating would have been small. And I had just come from a world that had taught me what small men in good coats cost the people beneath them. I just held up the deed so he could see it, and I told him the store was not for sale, had never been for sale, and would not be for sale, as long as I drew breath, and I walked out past him into the cold, ordinary morning of my own gray town, and behind me, I heard the developer, who had driven 40 minutes for nothing, ask Miles what exactly he had brought him here to buy. I owned the door now, free and clear, and I thought that made me safe. It did not make me safe. It made me findable, because a quartermaster had fallen, and a crashed price had a shape, and up in the frost court, in the high cold halls I had never seen. A warden named Coyle looked at the pattern of it, the abundance with no caravan, the goods with no source, the district that could not be starved, and unlike Rook and unlike Dace, Coyle did not ask where the goods were coming from as if it were an accounting problem. He asked it as a hunter asks where an animal dens, and he started patiently, coldly, with the full authority of the frost court behind him, to look for a door. Warden Coyle did not send men to threaten me, because Coyle did not know I existed yet. That was what made him worse than Rook and Dace put together. They had come at the goods. Coyle came at the pattern, and a pattern does not lie to you or run. He was the Frost Court's warden of the low quarters, which meant the Cinder Warren was technically his to govern, and he had governed it the way you govern a place you have written off by ignoring it until the day it stopped being reliably miserable. A hunter reads a forest by what is wrong in it, the silence where there should be birds, the trail where there should be none. Coyle read Emberhold the same way. A quarter that could not be starved from, a price that would not hold. A captain of the guard, Vera, whose patrols kept finding excuses to end in the Cinder Warren, who requisitioned lamp oil she did not report burning. He did not raid. He watched. He put quiet men on the rooftops of the Cinder Warren to mark who came and went, and he had them count, and the counting told him something that must have chilled even him, which was that the abundance had no supplier. No caravan brought it. No warehouse held it. It simply appeared in the deep of the night in one particular collapsed corner of the quarter and was gone by morning into 1,000 grateful hands. He was too jubilant to believe in miracles, so he believed in a door, and he began, patiently, to close his hand around the place he thought it must be, and I did not know any of it, because a man who watches well is a man you do not see, and I was busy those weeks with the thing that finally taught me the true cruelty of my own gift. The deep freeze came in the 11th week. Emberhold had a word for the nights when the long cold gathered itself and dropped, all at once, past the edge of what a body could survive. They called them killing nights, and they came a few times a winter, and the whole city braced for them the way a coast braces for a storm it cannot outrun. The hearth tenders doubled the ration for one night, if the frost court allowed it, which cost coin most did not have. Families crowded into single rooms and burned what they had and prayed. And people died anyway, every killing night, the old and the young, and the ones whose ember box had run cold, found stiff in the morning in the blue dawn, and carried out through gates in numbers everyone had learned not to count out loud. I found out a killing night was coming a day ahead from Vera, and I threw everything I had at it, and it was not enough, and that is the sentence I have to live with. I carried until my arms failed. I made crossing after crossing in a single night, which I had never done, and learned that the door did not care. One crossing a night was the rule, and it held, and so I did the only thing the rule left me. I stopped sleeping. I filled every hour before midnight buying and staging, and at midnight I carried the most desperate armload of my life through into a cellar where Vera had gathered the worst cases she could reach, the sick, the newborn, the old, and I turned my miracle into triage, and triage is just a soft word for choosing who you cannot save. There were 400 people. Vera knew would not see morning without help. I could carry enough fire and warmth for perhaps 80. I want you to sit in that number the way I have had to. 80 out of 400, and the door would not open again until the next midnight, by which time the night would have already done its counting. So I stood in that cellar with a captain who had seen more death than I could imagine. And we did the thing together. We chose. We sent the fire to the families with the most children, to the sick who might yet turn. We made the math as merciful as math can be, which is not very. And then I went back through my door into my warm, bright store, and I sat on the floor of the storeroom with my back against the cold steel. And I did not carry the 81st thing, because there was no 81st crossing, and somewhere on the other side of a door I owned free and clear. People I could have saved froze, because I could only hold so much. One of the 400 was Halden, the widow, the first family we ever freed from Rook, the one who had traded her dead husband's hammers for embers a swing at a time. She was on the wrong side of my 80, not because she mattered less, because she had no children in the room, with her and my mercy math counted children, and so the arithmetic that I had made as kind as arithmetic can be sent the fire past her door to a family with 3 little ones 2 streets over, and it was the right call, in the blue morning, all the same. Found End, sitting up against her cold, wall, with her husband's last hammer across her knees. Vera told me. She made herself tell me, because she said I did not get to give people fire, and then look away from the ones the fire did not reach. And she was right, and I have not looked away since. But I carried Halden out of that morning, and I have carried her every day after, because she is the exact weight of the second rule, the human cost of what one man can hold. And I needed to feel it, because it was about to make me reckless. That night broke something in me and built something else. Because here is what I understood, sitting on that floor at 3 a.m, with frost still melting off my coat. I had been playing Rook's game the whole time. A better Rook, a kinder Rook, a Rook who gave instead of took, but still a man standing between people and enough. Still a man rationing a miracle. Still a single choke point that a killing knight could overwhelm, and a warden could hunt, and a broken cousin could threaten. As long as the warmth of Emberhold ran through me, one man wide, once a night, I was not the cure. I was just a nicer bottleneck. The people of Emberhold did not need a better man to ration their survival to them. They needed to stop needing anyone to. I did not have the whole answer yet, but I had the shape of it, and the shape of it was the first genuinely dangerous thought I had ever had. Dangerous to the men who ran that world, because it was not about carrying more through the door. It was about carrying the right thing through the door, the thing that would make the door itself unnecessary, the thing that would let 40,000 people make their own fire and grow their own food and never again kneel to a man with a granary and a chain of office. Seeds, tools, knowledge, the means, not the meal. There was a second hunter that season, and I was too consumed by the first to see him. On my own side of the door, Miles had not let it go. Men like Miles never let it go. Humiliation is the one debt they always pay back. He had walked into that bank to steal my building and walked out, looking like a fool in front of a developer, and he had spent the weeks since doing the thing he was genuinely good at, which was following money home. He knew what a dying store cleared. He knew what I had paid the bank. The numbers did not close, and Miles could not stand a number that did not close any more than Dace could. He started asking around. He talked to the coin dealer 2 towns over, who who remembered a young man who paid in old gold and asked no questions. He talked to a teller, a cousin's cousin, who had seen me deposit cash in awkward amounts. He could not imagine a door because who could, but he could imagine the ugly ordinary explanations. And he began, quietly, to assemble a story about his cousin, Cole, and a great deal of untraceable cash, a story with a shape the authorities in my world take a very serious interest in. And he sat on it and waited for the moment it would hurt me most. He would find that moment. It would be the worst possible one. But that was still a week away, and I did not know it was coming, because I was about to walk into a frost court cell block with my heart in my throat, and a man can only watch one trap at a time. I was still turning that over, still weeks from acting on it, when Coyle's hand closed. He did not find the door. He was closer than I knew. His watchers had narrowed it to the collapsed cellar, and were only waiting to catch the light of a crossing, but he did not have it yet. And, being a patient hunter, he did the patient thing. He did not spring a trap on a door he could not yet see. He took the bait that was standing in the open in a patched captain's coat, requisitioning lamp oil, she did not report. They arrested Vera at the change of the watch, on charges that did not need to be true: misuse of guard resources, unlicensed trade, sedition, and the last one was the only real one. Because telling a hungry city that the granary is full is the most seditious thing a person can do in a kingdom of manufactured scarcity. They took her up out of the low quarters into the frost court's own cells, where the cold was a tool and not just a weather, and Coyle let it be known, quietly, in exactly the places where the man who supplied the cinder warren would hear it, what he had done and why. Because he had understood the one thing about me that mattered without ever seeing my face. He had understood that a man who gives everything away is a man who can be reached through the people he gives it to. He did not need to find my door if he could make me carry myself through it into his hand. Vera was not a prisoner. She was a message, and the message was addressed to me, and it said, "Come and be caught, or let her freeze in my cells the way you let the 81st freeze in the dark, and either way I win, because either way the abundance ends." I got the news from Toller, the boy soldier, who came to the cellar white and shaking at midnight, because it was the only place and the only hour he knew to find the stranger who might do something. And I stood there in the cold, with the door glowing warm behind me, my whole safe, bright world, one step to my back, and Nell's hand in mine, because she had woken and would not let go. And I understood that the game had finally cost me something I could not buy back with any amount of a dead king's gold. I could run. That was the terrible, available truth. I could step back through my door and close it and never open it again and be safe. 60,000 in debt shrinking, a store in my own name, a warm gray life. Emberhold would freeze without me, but Emberhold had been freezing before me, and no one in my world would ever know I had let it. Or I could do the thing I had spent this whole story learning I did not know how to do, which was fight a man who could not be beaten by making his product worthless, because Coyle was not selling anything. Coyle was holding a person I loved in a cold cell as bait, and there is no market solution to a hostage. There is only the oldest problem in any world, which is what you are willing to walk into the dark and lose for someone else. I looked at the door. I looked at Toller. I let go of Nell's hand and told her to stay warm. And then I did the thing that started the worst week of my life, the week I lost almost everything, the week that finally turned me from a man who fed a dying world into a man who set out to break the machine that was killing it. I went to get her. I did not storm the frost court cells because I am not a man who storms anything, and Coyle was counting on someone who was. What I did instead was the only thing I have ever been good at. I bought my way in with things no one in that world could refuse. A cell block runs on cold men doing a hard job for too little. And cold men can be reached the same way Rook's enforcers could, by the simple fact that I could make them warm. I did not bribe the guards with gold. Gold was suspicious. Gold was a bribe, and a bribed guard remembers you. I gave them fire. I came up out of the cinder warren with Toller as my guide, in a dead man's guard coat 2 sizes wrong, And at every cold post, between the low quarters and the cells, I was just another miserable soldier sharing a marvel, a little metal thing that made flame on the first strike. Here, keep it. Plenty more where that came from. By the time I reached the block that held Vera, half the guards on that watch owed the strange, generous soldier a warmth they had not felt in years. And not one of them looked at me twice, because a man who gives you fire on a killing cold night is the last man your eyes flag as a threat. I got her out. I will not pretend it was clean. There was a moment at the last gate when the sergeant of the watch was not cold enough or was too careful, and it came down to Vera, who even half frozen and a week starved was worth more in a corridor than any 6 men, and we left that gate faster than we came, and we did not look back at what she left behind her in it. But I got her out, and we ran the dark ways down into the cinder warren, and I put her through no door, because I could never carry her to safety. But I got her to the cellar and to Nell and to a fire, and for 1 hour I let myself believe I had won. I had not won. I had shown Coyle the one thing he was hunting for, because a patient hunter does not spring his trap on the bait. He springs it on what comes for the bait. Coyle had never much cared about Vera. Vera was a stake in the ground with a rope on it. What he had wanted was to see who would come out of the dark to cut her loose, and now he had seen not my face, not my door, but the shape of it, a supplier who could walk a cell block unseen, because he came bearing the exact miracle the whole city was starving for. He knew now, for certain, that the abundance was a person, that the person had been in his cells and slipped out, and that everything, the fire, the salt, the crashed prices, the seditious truth about the granary, all of it came down through one point, somewhere in the collapsed heart of the cinder warren. He pulled his watchers tight around that corner. He stopped waiting, and he made ready to take the door the moment it showed him its light. That was the trap on the far side of the world. The trap on my own side sprang the same night, and it wore my cousin's face, and it was so much smaller and so much crueler. I came back through my door near dawn, filthy, shaking, Vera's blood on my borrowed coat, and there were 2 cars in front of my store with lights that did not spin but did not need to, and a man on my step with a badge and a clipboard, and behind him, across the street, leaning on his good car with his hands in his good coat, my cousin Miles, watching because he had wanted to be there. He had finally found the moment his story would hurt me most, and he had not even had to lie very much. He had told them what was true from the outside. A failing store, a dead man's debt paid off in months, large cash deposits in awkward amounts, old gold with no provenance, a coin dealer's records, a young man who could not possibly have earned it. It has an ugly name in my world, the movement of money that cannot explain itself, and it is the kind of ugly that freezes your accounts and seals your premises and sits you in a small room for a very long day, while men who have decided what you are ask you to prove you are not. They sealed the store. That is the sentence the whole worst week hangs on. Pending investigation, they sealed my store, put their paper across my door, the front door, but a seal is a seal, and a store that is sealed is not open, and not mine to close. And mine to be alone in at midnight, and I knew, standing on the sidewalk, in the gray dawn, with a badge asking me where the gold came from, exactly what that meant on the other side of the world. I knew it the way you know a death, before the phone finishes ringing. The door would not open. Not that midnight, sealed and watched. Not the next, while I sat in a small room. Not the third, while lawyers I paid with the last clean cash I had argued about my frozen accounts. 3 nights. And I could do nothing at all, but sit in my own world's machinery and watch a clock crawl toward a midnight I could not reach. I want you to understand what those 3 nights were on my side, because it is easy to hear sealed the store and think of it as paperwork. It was a small, bright room and a paper cup of bad coffee and 2 tired people whose whole job was to decide I was a criminal and work backward. They asked me the same questions in 15 shapes. Where does the gold come from? Who do you work for? What are you moving and for whom? And I could not tell them the truth, because the truth was a freezing city on the other side of a steel door, And the truth would have gotten me a different kind of room. So I sat there and gave them the useless real answer that I sold old inventory, that my father found value in things people threw away. And I watched them not believe me. And the whole time, the entire time, a clock on the wall crawled toward midnight, and every hour it swept past was an hour I was not standing in a cellar with fire in my arms. And they thought the sweat on me was guilt. It was not guilt. It was a man doing the worst arithmetic of his life, calculating in a fluorescent room exactly how many people a bureaucratic delay was going to freeze in a world these two would have committed me for describing. The second of those 3 nights was a killing night in Ember Hold. I was not there. That is its own particular hell, to lose people and not even be allowed to stand in the cold while it happens. I have it from Vera, later, in pieces, in a voice gone flat the way hers went when the thing was too big for feeling. Coyle had pulled the cinder warren tight, cut the thin legal trickle of upper city salt as a punishment for the district that hid his phantom supplier. And then the cold came down, one of the worst of that winter, and the district that had learned, that I had taught, to expect the fire to come at midnight, waited for a rectangle of warm gold light in a collapsed cellar. And it did not come. It did not come because a man in a good coat across a street in another world wanted his cousin to look small. And there is no version of that sentence that will ever stop being obscene to me. Taller was one of them, the boy soldier, the one who came through my door's rumor to find me on the night they took Vera, who wore a spear he was too young for, and guided me through the dark to the cells in a dead man's coat, and never once asked what I would give him for it. He had been in the cinder warren that killing night, at the cellar, because the cellar was where the fire came, and he had kept the others calm. Vera said, told them the stranger would come. The stranger always came. Hold on, and he had held the little ones and waited for a warm gold light in the dark, and the light did not come. And in the morning they found him the way you find the ones who give their warmth away. First, at the center of a knot of children who lived because he had. He was 17. He waited for me, and I did not come because a man in a good coat wanted to watch me sweat. I have made my peace with a great deal of what the door cost me. I have not made it with that, and I do not intend to. They died waiting for me. Not all of them, but enough, and the enough had faces now, had names I had learned around a brazier, and the cruelest part, the part Vera could barely say, was that my abundance had made it worse. Before me, the cinder warren had known how to suffer a killing night, huddled and hopeless, and expecting nothing. I had taught them to expect warmth, taught them to depend on the door, thinned the old brutal habits of survival, because I had promised, with every midnight crossing, that they would not need them anymore. And then I vanished for 3 nights, and the people who had unlearned despair had nothing to fall back on. And the bottleneck they had all come to trust closed without warning, and that is the exact horror I had glimpsed on the night of the 80. A single point of mercy is a single point of failure. I had known it. I had not fixed it in time. And 40 feet of sealed doorway and one small, vengeful man had turned my great gift into the instrument of the thing I most wanted to prevent. They found nothing on me in the end. There was nothing to find. The gold was real, and its trail led 2 towns over, and then simply stopped at a store's back wall, which no investigator on my earth would ever think to open at midnight. They unfroze my accounts and unsealed my door with a shrug and an apology-shaped silence, and Miles's story fell apart because it had no true ending. Only an ugly middle, and he got nothing out of it but the thing he had actually come for, which was 3 nights of watching me suffer. But by the time the paper came off my door, I was not the man it had gone on. Something had finished burning down in me, and something colder and clearer stood in the ash. Because I had finally understood the whole machine, top to bottom, and I understood it because I had just been broken by it in 2 worlds at once. Coyle had not killed the cinder warren. Coyle was a symptom, same as Dace, same as Rook. The long cold had not killed the cinder warren either. The long cold was just weather. What killed them was a system, deliberate and old, and the same in every world I had touched. that took the things people needed to live and put them behind one hand, one price, one door, one man, and called the chokehold order. And at the top of Emberhold's version of that machine, above Coil, above the whole Frost Court, sat the thing the entire dying city had been built around and taught never to question. Vera told me its name when I finally crossed again into a grieving quarter, told me the way you confess the thing you have been most afraid to say out loud. The hearth, the last great fire in the world. And the man who owned it, who rationed the warmth of 40,000 lives an hour at a time to keep them kneeling, who had every reason in that cold hell to make sure the winter never, ever ended because a warm city is a free city, and a free city does not need a king. She told me his name in the grieving quarter, standing over a row of the wrapped dead with Taller among them, and she did not spare me, and I did not want her to. She had every right to hate me. I had made her people need me, and then I had failed to come, and a lesser woman, or a wiser one, would have driven me back through my door and told me never to open it again, that the abundance was a curse with a man's face, and the Cinder Warren had survived crueler winters without me. She did not. She stood in the cold with her healing arm bound to her chest, and Taller's blood not a week old on the stones, and she asked me one question, the only one that mattered, the one that turned me from a merchant into whatever I became after. She asked me whether I was going to keep bringing crumbs to a starving city one armload at a time until the door failed again and killed the rest of them, or whether I was finally going to do something about the reason the city was starving at all. Because she had understood, before I had the courage to, that feeding Emberhold had never been the answer. It had been a very long, very kind way of losing. As long as one man rationed their survival, they would die every time that man was stopped, and men can always be stopped, by a warden, by a killing knight, by a cousin in a good coat. The only thing that could save Emberhold was to make Emberhold not need saving, to break the hand that held the fire and put the fire back in 40,000 pairs of hands, where a warden could not seize it and a king could not ration it, and no single sealed door could ever again go dark and take a boy of 17 with it. His name was Vane, and I stopped that day, being a man who carried fire through a door. I became a man who was going to take the fire back. To break Vane, I first had to understand the hearth, and understanding the hearth meant understanding the single largest lie a civilization has ever been told, which is a claim I do not make lightly, having since learned that my own world runs on a few of the same kind. The hearth sat at the center of Emberhold, under a dome the old kings had built, and it was the last great fire in the world, and that much was true. It burned without wood. It had burned for centuries, and the Frost Court, and Vane at the top of it, controlled every ember of it, and doled it out an hour a day per household, and taxed the doling, and let it be known in 10,000 sermons and laws that the hearth was the only warmth left to humankind, a sacred and finite mercy, and that, without the court's careful rationing of it, it would burn out, and the last of the world would freeze in the dark. Obey, and get your hour. Question, and lose it. That was the whole theology of the place, and 40,000 people had been born into it, and would die in it, kneeling for an hour of fire in a fortress that sat, I was about to learn, on more fuel than it could burn in 1,000 years, because the hearth did not burn wood. It burned stone. I had one in my drawer under the register, the warm black stone, the first relic Nell's people ever paid me with, the one that was always faintly warm to the touch. I had thought it a curiosity, a magic trinket. It was fuel. It was the fuel, the same stone the great hearth burned, and the world was littered with it, and here is the part that took me a week of turning it over in my hands to believe. The Cinder Warren, the ruined quarter my door opened into, the ash heap where the hold threw the people it had given up on, was named for the mountains of spent black stone piled there. Cinders, dead stone, burned out, worthless, the court's own refuse, dumped in the low quarter for centuries and built over and forgotten. Only it was not dead. I found that out the way I found out everything, by being a shopkeeper who could not stop testing his stock. a lump of cinder cinder, cold and gray, and discarded, would not light for anything those people had. But I came from a world with more ways to make heat than theirs had ever dreamed of, and on the fourth or fifth thing I tried, a simple reagent I could buy in a hardware aisle for a few dollars, the dead stone woke. It glowed. It warmed. It burned, low and long and clean, for days, off a chunk the size of a fist that had been lying in a gutter since before Nell was born. The stone the court called spent was not spent. It had only been declared spent because a fortress standing on infinite fuel is a fortress no king can rule by rationing fire, and so for centuries the Frost Court had thrown the still living stone into the low quarter and called it ash and taught the poor to stand on a fortune in warmth and shiver. The people of the Cinder Warren were freezing to death on top of the thing that could have saved them. The discarded people, thrown out on a heap of discarded fire. When I understood it, I sat down in that cellar and I could not speak for a while. Because it was the whole world in one obscene image, and it was my world too, and it was every world. The way the ones who own the scarce thing will bury the abundance and salt ground over it rather than let the gap close that they live in. I woke the first stone in front of Vera, and I did it on purpose, because she needed to see it, and because I needed a witness to the moment the whole shape of the war changed. We were in the cellar, the brazier dead to save fuel, our breath white. I took a gray lump of cinder cinder, a thing she had walked past 10,000 times, a thing her people used to prop doors and weigh down cloth, refuse, ballast, nothing. I set it on the stone floor between us, and I woke it with a few cents of a thing from a hardware shelf and 30 seconds of a method her whole civilization had been forbidden to learn. And the dead stone bloomed a deep, steady orange, and heat rolled off it into that frozen cellar. And Vera, who did not startle at drawn blades, who had buried more people than she could count, put her hand out toward the warmth of a rock. She had been told her entire life was ash, and I watched the captain of the guard begin, silently, to shake. Not from cold, from the size of the lie. She had knelt for an hour of the king's fire her whole life, while standing on a fortune in it. Nell, half asleep in the corner, crawled to the glow and pressed her small hands almost against it and looked at me the way she had looked at the orange, and I understood that I was not going to be able to stop now, no matter what it cost me. Because there is no walking away from the moment you show the discarded people that they were thrown out on top of the very thing they were told they lacked. That was the day I stopped carrying meals and started carrying the means. Because the second rule, the cruel one man's arms was once a night, had been beating me the whole time I fought it, and I finally stopped fighting it and started listening to it. I could not carry enough fire for 40,000 people. I would never be able to, but I did not have to. They were standing on the fire. What they lacked was not fuel. What they lacked was the key, and a key you can carry in a coat pocket. A few dollars of the right reagent. The knowledge of how to wake the stone, how to bank it, how to build a small, safe stove around it that would not choke a room. That I could carry. That one man could bring through a door once a night for the rest of his life and never run dry, because I was no longer smuggling the warmth. I was smuggling the end of needing me. So I became a student, on my side of the door, in a way I never was in school. My store in those weeks stopped being a store and became a laboratory of the cheapest kind. I spent my days in places I had never had reason to enter. A farm supply co-op an hour out of town, where an old man in a seed cap walked me through cold frame growing and open pollinated varieties and thought I was a survivalist, which I suppose by then I was. Library books stacked on the register, homesteading manuals, a century-old text on making soap and salt and preserving meat, forum threads printed at the library about off-grid heat and safe indoor combustion. Because if I taught a family to burn stone in a sealed and killed them with the fumes, I would be no better than vain. I learned to think like a man building a civilization from a hardware aisle, which is a strange thing to become at 26 behind the counter your grandfather built. And my father, who found value in things people threw away, would have understood it better than anyone and I talked to him sometimes, out loud, in the empty store, at midnight, the way you do. I learned about the reagent and about safe combustion and ventilation. I learned about fast crops, the greens and grains a person can grow indoors, under light, in the dead of any winter, in a bucket of soil, because a city that can only be fed through my arms is a city that dies when my arms are stopped. But a city that can grow a fifth of its own food in 10,000 windowsills is a city that has taken a step off its knees. I bought seed, the open, pollinated kind that begets more seed, so that what I brought would multiply instead of running out. I bought hand tools, the human-powered kind, drills and missiles and looms, the technology of a world before mine had electricity, which was exactly the technology a world like Emberhold could actually use. I filled my crossings with the means of production instead of the products, and it was slower, and it was harder. And no single crossing looked like a miracle the way an armload of soup had, and it was the only thing I ever did that actually worked. Vera built the rest, and this is the part I am proudest of because it was never mine. I could bring the key and the seed and the knowledge, but I could not stay, could not organize, could not be the thing a movement needs, which is people who belong to it. Vera could. She took the waking of the stone, and she did not hoard it the way every instinct, a lifetime of scarcity had given her, must have screamed to. She gave it away. She taught it. She took the first warmed stones through the Cinder-Warren household by household, and taught a widow to wake her own, and that widow taught two more, and within a month the poorest, deadest quarter of Emberhold glowed at night with 1,000 small fires that no court had lit, and no tithe had taxed, and no warden could seize. And you cannot ration a warmth that people must fire in every home at once. And you cannot ration a warmth make for themselves out of the ground they stand on. The Cinder-Warren, the ash heap, the place the hold through its hopeless, became the first free warm quarter in Emberhold in 11 years. And the seeds went into 10,000 windows, and the first pale green shoots came up in the dead of the long cold, and a child who had never seen a growing thing in her life put her hand near one and did not understand, and had to be taught the word, and the word was spring, and it undid the whole quarter the way an orange had once undone Nell. And the quarter changed under my hands in a way that no armload of soup had ever changed it, because this time the change did not leave when I did. Bran's daughter, the one I had given the antibiotics to, lived and then thrived, and then, months on, I came through the door to find her running, actually running, down a Cinder-Warren alley that had a woken stone burning at every third doorway, a warm street in the ash heap, and Bran stood in the door of a house that used to shake with cold and now had greens in the window, and he did not thank me, because we were past thanking. He just put a cup of something hot in my hands and went back to teaching his neighbor how to bank a stone for the night. The Floff house the old brothers ran stopped being a place men went to die and became a workshop, because warm men with full bellies do not lie down, they build, and they had begun, with the hand tools I carried and the endless woken fire, to make things again, tools and cloth and small good objects that the quarter traded among itself in an economy that owed nothing to any court. Halden's house I could not fill, and did not try. I left it as it was, cold and empty, because Vera said the quarter needed to keep one to remember by, and she was right. And the empty house with the last hammer still inside it did more to keep the Cinder-Warren from ever kneeling again than any speech I could have made. I would come through at midnight and stand a moment in a quarter that had been the coldest, deadest, most hopeless place I had ever seen, and watch 1,000 small fires I had not lit burning in 1,000 windows I would never enter, and understand that this, not the gold and not the face slaps, and not any of it, was the only thing I had ever done that was going to outlast me. You cannot unteach a people that the ash is alive. It was the one gift the door gave that the door could not take back. Vane felt it before he understood it, the way Rook and Dace had, because the men who own scarcity all have the same nerve, and I kept pressing on it. The ration stopped mattering in the low quarters. The tithe on the hearth went unpaid, not in rebellion, just in irrelevance. Because why would you pay for an hour of a distant king's fire when your own hearth burned all night for free? The chokehold was loosening one house at a time, and Vane, up in his dome, looked at a city that was very slowly, very quietly, standing up off its knees, and felt his whole 1,000-year monopoly on human survival begin, for the first time, to slip. And a man like that, when he feels the thing his power rests on begin to fail, does not examine his conscience. He reaches for the last tool the owners of scarcity have when abundance comes, the one Rook reached for, and Dace reached for, and Coil reached for. Only Vane had a whole court and a holy fire, and 40,000 frightened subjects to reach with. He reached for me. He had finally learned there was a door, and a man who came through it, and that the man was the source of everything unraveling his world. And he decided, in his cold dome at the top of a dying city, that the surest way to make 40,000 people need him again was to find that door, and close it, and remind them all what the dark had cost. 2 reckonings came for me, at once, one on each side of the door, and I want to tell you about the smaller one first, because the smaller one was Miles, and Miles is where I learned that I had actually become the thing this whole story was trying to make me. Miles was not finished. His investigation had collapsed. They had found nothing, because there was nothing of the kind to find, but the collapse had cost him. He had gone to a developer and promised a building. He could not deliver. He had gone to the authorities with a story that fell apart and made a fool of the people who had listened to him. In a small town, that kind of thing has a price, and Miles, who had spent his whole life standing next to people with less so he would look like more, was suddenly the man whose word had proven worthless, and word is the only capital a man like Miles ever really has. He came to the store one last time. Not in a good coat. He came to borrow, which is how it had always started with him and my father, and he dressed it up as reconciliation, family, blood, water, the whole tired liturgy, and I understood as he stood there that a version of me from a year before, the version drowning in debt and swallowing his contempt, would have either caved or savored the chance to crush him. I did neither, and the not doing was the whole measure of the distance I had come. I did not lend him a cent, because you do not feed a man's power to take by giving him more to take with. And I did not destroy him, though I could have, though I had, by then, the kind of quiet money that could have bought his debts and called them all at once and put him on the street. I just made his power over me worthless. The only way I had learned to beat anyone. I told him the truth, plainly, without heat, that he had spent his life standing between people and what they had coming, taking his cut of the gap, that I had met bigger men than him who ran the same racket on a bigger scale, and I had unmade every one of them the same way, not by hating them, but by making the thing they hoarded not matter, and that he no longer mattered, not as an enemy, not as family, not as anything. He could not threaten a man whose store was paid for, and whose accounts were clean, and whose real wealth lived somewhere he would never find. There was nothing of mine left for him to stand between me and I had closed the gap he lived in, and a man who lives in a gap, when the gap closes, simply has nowhere left to stand. He left, and he did not come back. And the strange thing, the thing I did not expect, is that I felt no triumph. Only a kind of clean quiet, the way a room feels after you finally throw out a thing that had been rotting in it for years. That is the difference between the man who fights scarcity and the man who owns it. The owner needs you to lose. The other one just needs to stop needing you to. The larger reckoning was Vane, and Vane did not come to borrow. He came with the full weight of the Frost Court, because Coil had finally done his patient work, and they had found the cellar. Not the door itself. The door only lived at midnight, and only for me, but the place, the collapsed corner of the cinder warren, where the abundance had been born. Soldiers of the court in the good armor, and the real weapons that the low quarters never saw. And he did to the cinder warren what men like him always do at the end. He tried to turn the cold back on. He cut the district off, sealed the ways up into the city, declared the cinder warren in rebellion, which by the theology of the place it was, since it had stopped paying for its fire, and he meant to make an example of it, the oldest example, the one his whole reign was built on. He would let the winter and the hunger do to the rebellious quarter what they had always done, and the rest of Emberhold would watch and remember and kneel a little lower for their hour of the king's fire, grateful it was not them. And it did not work. That is the thing I will remember to the end of my life, the sight of Vane's oldest weapon simply failing in his hand. Because the cinder warren was not cold anymore, he sealed it off from the hearth, and the hearth did not matter, because 10,000 small stones burned in 10,000 homes, woken from the ash heaps he himself had dumped there. He cut off the ration, and the ration did not matter, because green things were coming up in the windows, and the hunters had salt again to keep what they killed. He surrounded a quarter to starve it and freeze it into obedience, and found that he had surrounded the one place in Emberhold that no longer needed the single thing he owned. You cannot make a warm-fed people kneel for warmth and food. The threat that had held 40,000 souls for 11 years just stopped against the cinder warren being a threat at all. I watched Vane's soldiers stand around a quarter they had come to punish, and I watched the punishment not land, and I understood that the whole war was already won, and had been won in 1,000 kitchens the moment the first widow woke her own stone. Everything after that was just the powerful being the last to know. But the powerful being the last to know is exactly when the powerful are most dangerous, because a man whose threats have stopped working reaches for the one threat left, which is simply to break the thing that unmade him. Vane could not outwarm the cinder warren anymore, so he would take the door. He would find it however he had to, tear apart every stone of that cellar, hold every soul in it, until the man who came through at midnight had nowhere to come but into his hand, and then he would close the door forever, and the reagent would run out eventually, and the knowledge would be hunted, and in a generation, too, the lie could be rebuilt. The fire gathered back into one dome, the stone-declared dead dome, and the kneeling could resume. Tyranny is patient. It plays for centuries. It only has to win once and hold. So I could not simply keep my head down and let abundance quietly spread and win. I had run out of quiet. Vane had the cellar cordoned, my people trapped inside it, Vera and Nell among them, and Coil's watchers waiting for the light of my door so they could pour through it the instant I opened it. If I crossed at midnight, I crossed into a trap. If I did not cross, the cinder warren would hold on its own stone for a while, but Vane would grind it down, find the door, and end everything. There was only one move left, and it was the most dangerous thing I ever did, and it was the exact opposite of what a man defending a secret door should do. I decided to stop hiding it. I decided to go up. Not through my own door into the trap they had set at its mouth, but the long way, the way a person of that world would go, up through the sealed ways, with Vera's soldiers and a coat over my face, into the high city I had never seen, to the dome at the center of it, to the hearth itself, and to Vane. Because a lie that rules by scarcity dies the moment the abundance is made undeniable in front of everyone, and the most undeniable place, the one stage where the whole city could see it at once, was the foot of the great fire the whole city had been taught to worship. I was going to walk into the Frost Court, in front of Vane and his soldiers and every subject who could be made to witness it, and I was going to show them all what the cinder warren already knew, that the stone was not dead, that the fire was not finite, that the winter was not a verdict but a business, and the business was Vane's, and it was over, the night before we went up. Vera and I sat by a woken stone in the cellar, and did not talk about the plan, because the plan was as good as it was going to get, and saying it again would only sand the courage off it. We talked about after. It was the first time either of us had let ourselves use the word. She asked me what I would do when it was over, and I realized I did not have an answer that lived on only one side of the door, and neither did she, and we sat with that, two people from two worlds with a threshold between them that only one could cross, trying to imagine an after that had both of them in it. I told her I did not know how it worked, whether a man could build a life, half in a store and half in a hold. Whether the door would let me, whether the door would even still be there when the fire was free and no one needed carrying. I told her I wanted to find out. She looked at me for a long moment, with the frost captain's wariness finally, fully gone from her face, and she said that a woman who had spent her whole life being told the warmth was forever had just watched both of those turn out to be lies, and that she was not inclined, anymore, to believe anyone who told her a thing was impossible. Then she put another stone on the fire, and neither of us slept, and in the morning we went to end a king. Going up was its own education, because I had spent all these months in the low quarters and had never once seen the city that sat on top of them. The sealed ways opened, with the help of guards, who owed the strange, generous stranger a warmth onto a high ember hold I had not imagined, and the sight of it finished in me whatever anger still needed finishing. Because the high city was warm. Not rationed warm, not an hour a day warm. The avenues near the dome ran with heat. The frost court's halls glowed with open fires. The powerful of Emberhold had never once in 11 years gone to bed cold, and they were surrounded, right, every day, by the frozen evidence of the people they let freeze, so that the warmth would keep its price. The lie was not even hidden up there. It was just far enough above the suffering that the people who benefited from it never had to smell the smoke of a family burning its last chair. I walked through that warm, high city toward the great dome with a quarter's worth of the discarded at my back, people carrying woken stones openly in their bare hands like small suns, and I watched the warm and comfortable of Emberhold come to their windows and doors and see, for the first time, the poor of the low quarters walking up out of the cold carrying a fire the court had sworn could not exist. And I watched the doubt start, house by house, the most dangerous thing in any kingdom. The moment the comfortable begin to wonder if the story they were told to keep them comfortable was ever true. Vera thought it was suicide. She was probably right. She came anyway, and so did a quarter's worth of people who had spent 11 years being told they were refuse and had just discovered they had been sitting on the sun. We went up together toward the last great fire in the world and the man who rationed it, and I carried no weapon, because I never had, because the only thing I had ever needed to carry was the truth that ends the gap, and it does not weigh anything at all. The dome of the hearth was the most beautiful and most obscene thing I have ever stood inside. Beautiful, because the great fire really was ancient and vast and lovely, a slow orange sea of burning stone under a vault of old carved gods. Obscene because of what surrounded it. The warm and the powerful of Emberhold ranged on their tiers in the heat, and at the center, on a high cold seat, the man who sold the world its own survival by the hour, and the whole architecture of the place built to say one thing to anyone who entered, that this fire was the only fire, that it was finite and holy and theirs, and that your life was a thing they let you keep. Vane was not what I expected. I had built him in my head into a monster, and he was only an old man in fine furs with a tired, intelligent, utterly certain face, the face of someone who has ruled so long by one idea that the idea has become the whole shape of his mind. He looked at me, a soft foreigner in a low quarter coat, and at Vera beside me, and at the ragged column of the cinder warren behind us, carrying their small glowing stones. And he did not order us killed, not at first, because he did not yet understand that he was in danger. He thought I had come to bargain, or to beg, or to be made an example of. Everyone always thinks that, right up until the end. Everyone who owns the gap assumes that everyone else wants to own a piece of it too. He asked me what I thought I was doing, bringing the refuse of the low quarters into the holy dome. And I did not answer him with words, because words were his whole kingdom, sermons and laws and prices, and you do not beat a man on his own ground. I answered him the way I had answered, every one of them, rook and dace and coil and miles, the only way I had ever known how to win. I made his scarcity worthless in front of everyone who believed in it. I took a stone from my coat, a gray, cold, dead lump of cinder warren cinder, the court's own refuse, the ash they had been throwing into the low quarter for centuries and calling spent. I held it up so the tears could see that it was nothing, a piece of the very garbage their theology was built on. And then, in the light of the one great fire they had all been taught was the last warmth in the world, I woke it. A few cents of a thing from a hardware aisle. 30 seconds of a method a whole civilization had been forbidden to know. And the dead stone bloomed in my hand, deep and orange and warm. A second fire, a small, ordinary, defiant sun held up under the dome of the Great One, and I turned slowly so that every tear, every furred lord, every soldier, every witness Vane had gathered to watch me be made an example of could see with their own eyes the thing that unmade him. The fire was not finite. The stone was not dead. The winter was not a verdict. It was a business, and here, burning in the palm of a nobody, was the proof, and behind me 100 of the discarded lifted their own woken stones toward the vault. 100 small suns, answering the Great One, and the dome of the last fire in the world filled with the light the Frost Court had spent. 11 years and 40,000 lives, insisting could not exist. I did not have to say anything after that. That is the thing about the truth that ends a gap. You only have to make it undeniable, and then it does its own work, faster than any army. I watched it move through the dome like the heat off the stones. I watched a furred lord on the third tier stare at the fire in his own hand that he had lit from a beggar's stone and begin, visibly, to do the arithmetic of every cold night his tithe had bought while this was always possible. I watched Vane's own soldiers, men who went home to families that froze on the ration same as anyone below the high avenues, look at the warmth in a low quarter child's bare hands and understand that they had been guarding a lie that cost them too. Vane shouted for order for the fire to be put out, for the rebels to be taken, and the oldest weapon failed in his hand one last time because you cannot order men to kill people for the crime of being warm when you have just shown those men that they were owed the same warmth all along. The soldiers did not move, or rather, they moved, but not the way he commanded. They lowered their weapons, one and then a dozen, and then all of them, and the sound of 100 spears grounding on the stone of that dome is the sound I would use if I could only keep one, for the noise a lie makes when it finally breaks. I should have felt triumph standing in that light. I did not, or not only, because a victory does not empty out the chairs that are already empty. Somewhere under the noise of 100 spears grounding, I was thinking of Toller, 17, found at the center of a knot of children he had kept warm with his own body on a night the door did not open, waiting for a fire that came 3 days too late to a dome he would never see. I was thinking of Halden and her husband's last hammer across her cold knees, the wrong side of an armload of mercy. I was thinking of the 81st, whoever they were, the one past the edge of what a single man could carry, and all the ones like them. A whole ledger of the people the second rule had cost me before I learned to stop being a bottleneck and start being a key. The fire I held up in that dome was for the living, and it saved them, and it was worth everything. But I lit it standing on the names of the ones it came too late for, and I have never once let myself forget that the gap I closed had a body count, and that every one of those bodies was the price of how long it took me to understand. That feeding a broken system is not the same as fixing it. Vera found my hand in the crowd and held it, because she carried the same ledger, and we let the city cheer around us, and we grieved in the middle of the cheering, the way you learn to when you win something late. Vane fell that day, and I never touched him. His own court took him down off his cold, high seat, not out of justice. They had no more justice in them than they ever had, but out of the same arithmetic that ran everything in that world and mine, a king whose only power was the rationing of survival is worth nothing. The moment survival is free. The way they had discarded the stone and the poor, and everything else that had stopped turning a profit, and everything else that had stopped a profit. He ended as the least among the people he had ruled, alive, which was more mercy than he had shown any killing night, kept warm, whether he liked it or not, by a fire he could no longer own. I am told he never understood it, to the end. Men like that never do. They think the gap is the natural state of the world, and they cannot conceive that a person would want to close it, because closing it is the one thing that never once occurred to them. Emberhold did not become paradise. I want to be honest, because I have earned the right to be. The long cold did not lift. The winter was still weather, and weather does not care about a revolution. People still had to work and want, and some still went without, because a broken monopoly is not the same as an easy life. But the shape of the thing had changed, all the way down, and the change was permanent, because you cannot unknow that the stone is alive. The hearth became one fire among 10,000. The ration ended, not by decree but by irrelevance. Seeds went from the low quarters up into the high city, and the first true crop came in that spring, a real spring, thin and cold but green. The first anyone under 40 had ever seen. And I stood on the wall with Vera and watched 40,000 people, who had been taught they lived in a dying world, begin, slowly, unevenly, stubbornly, to live in a living one instead. Nell learned the word for the color the fields turned, and taught it to the younger children the way you teach a thing that was almost lost, carefully, like it mattered because it did. On my side, there was not much left to reckon. The debt was gone. The store was mine, 60 years of my family's name, over a door in my own name at last. Miles faded into the small gray life of a man whose one talent had been standing next to people with less. In a town where I no longer had less than anyone, I kept the store open. I will always keep the store open. And not only because the door lives where the store lives, though it does. That first rule holds to this day. I keep it open because a man should have somewhere to stand in the world he was born in, even when his heart has walked through a door into another one. Because that is where I ended, in the end, if a thing like this ends. Not rich, though I could have been the richest man in either world, and chose in the way that matters not to be, because I had spent a year learning exactly what the hoarding of enough costs the people you hoard it from. Not a king, though a grateful hold offered me things that looked like crowns, and I wanted none of them, having seen up close what a throne built on other people's cold is worth. What I ended as was a bridge, one man wide, a door between a world that had too much and a world that had learned it did not have too little after all, only a lie about it. And I spent my life after that carrying between them, not fire anymore, not salt, not survival. They made their own now, but the smaller, better things. A book, an orange, a seed of something new. The traffic of two worlds that no longer needed saving and had only to be joined. And Vera. I could never carry her through the door. The threshold was mine alone, one man wide to the last. So I did the only thing left, which was to carry myself the other way, more and more, until the store on the gray side was the place I visited, and the hold on the cold side was the place I lived, with a captain who had stopped believing anything was impossible. On the day she watched a rock she'd been told was ash burn warm in a stranger's hand. It is not the ending, the story's promise, the one where the hero comes home in triumph. I did not come home. I found a new one on the far side of a doorway, in the coldest place I had ever seen, made warm by the people in it. That turned out to be the better ending. It usually is. I still do not know who made the door, or why it chose my father's dying store, or whether the long cold that gripped that world for 11 years was ever only weather, or whether something made it, the way Vane made a famine out of a full granary, on a scale I have not let myself look at yet. There is a shape behind all of it I have only seen the edge of, and one of these midnights I am going to have to walk toward it. But that is another crossing, and this one is done, and it closes the way I promised you it would, warm, with everyone I could save saved, and the ones I could not carried, always, in the only place a man can carry the ones he lost. Scarcity is a story someone tells you to keep you in line. My father knew it behind a counter in a dying town, finding value in the things the world threw away. I learned it across a threshold, in a fortress freezing on top of the sun. I have spent my life since telling 40,000 people, and one gray town, and now you, a different story. There was always enough. There was always enough. They only ever told you there wasn't so you would kneel for your share. Stop kneeling. Go find your door.